Sorry. So as the poll demonstrates, the spring left us with not a lot of data and not a lot of insight, which brings us to today's topic of discussion, data transparency. So what is data transparency and why are we talking about it today? It is a powerful tool for shining a light on where inequities may exist. It includes multiple measures to tell a story, and it is easily accessible and digestible to families, students, and decision makers. What is it not? A tool used for punitive accountability. It does not only include assessment data, but again, multiple measures. And it is not just a series of large and overwhelming data sets, but understandable to key decision makers and stakeholders. So why are we talking about this now? We know that students are coming in with very different learning experiences from distance learning. Some students were in pods, others received individualized instruction, while others participated in distance learning. National estimates show that students are returning with varying levels of unfinished instruction. Some research indicates that on average, Black students could lose up to 10 months of learning, Latino students could lose up to 9 months, and students from low-income backgrounds could lose more than a year. But we do not yet know. So how do we chart a path forward? Where do we go from here? Let's hear from you. If you have your phone available, please take it out and go to www.menti.com. It'll ask you to enter a passcode. Please use 601152 and take a moment to brainstorm 3 things which you think schools might need to know how students are doing right now. What are some pieces of data that you believe schools might need to chart a path forward? Take about 45 seconds to answer this question. All right, and take another few seconds. And just about another 5 seconds. A long 5 seconds. All right, so take a minute and look at what some of the most common measures you've indicated here are. We couldn't agree more, and thank you for your thoughts on needing data about connectivity, engagement, attendance, SEL, general well-being, and also engagement in classes. That brings us to our session today, charting a path forward using data. We saw and we agree that there are a variety of needs. Today, we'll be focusing in on 3 specific ways to chart a path forward using data. First, we need real-time data on current student attendance and opportunities to learn in order to plan appropriately and meet student needs. Second, we need longer-term annual data on report cards that have multiple measures and are easily understandable and accessible to a wide variety of stakeholders. And third, today we will also dig into one specific area on state and local report cards, state assessment data. So now I'm really excited to kick it over to Hetty to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I did see that attendance was coming up a lot. So I want to take a moment to unpack what does it mean to monitor attendance, and I would say also absenteeism during this very challenging time. Can you go to the next slide, please? So one thing I want to offer up before I talk about how do we want to look at the data is it might be helpful to remind everyone that attendance data actually has been used for multiple purposes historically. Some of it has been to allocate funding or to ensure compliance with compulsory ed. That's really what we track truancy or unexcused absences for. It's also been used around accountability, and under ESSA, it has been adopted as an accountability metric in 36 states. It's also used and can be used for early warning and informing program and policy decisions. Right now, one thing that you may want to think about is I think we need to use the purposes of guidance to the purposes of attendance data to guide how we think about how it should be used. This is really an important time to hold schools harmless from funding cuts. You don't want them to think that kids need to show up in order to get paid, especially during the time of a pandemic. We don't want to be emphasizing punitive legal approaches to getting kids to school. That is not the way to support them and connect to them. And so you really want to create those alternatives. This is a time where people may be more and more understanding of the fact that punitive approaches are not the right approach and aren't shown to be effective, and that we really want to refrain from high stakes accountability. This is in keeping with the data transparency slide that was shown earlier. What we want to emphasize is using attendance data for early warning and for informing program and policy decisions. Early warning to activate supports, and then looking at program and policy decisions. And what I'm going to talk today about is how do we make sure our data gets used that way. Next slide. This is so critical because we know from a wealth of research that absenteeism is both a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. Next slide. When you see high levels of chronic absence, it means that kids are not physically and emotionally healthy and safe, don't feel a sense of belonging, connection, support, don't feel academic challenge and engagement, or don't feel the adults and the students around them aren't there to support these positive conditions for learning. If we want kids to show up, we need to notice when absenteeism happening to find out which of any of these things are a problem and how do you address them. And I would add that right now under COVID-19, we now add the other level of connectivity and whether or not kids can get online in the first place. Next slide. We really think we need to expand how we think about collection of data. If you think about, we are monitoring right now whether kids participate or not. But if kids had chronic absence in the past, if you lost contact, the earlier comments today talked a lot about how we have to find our kids. They can't even benefit from what we're teaching. We have to make sure kids have connectivity. And we also have to make sure that schools are putting in place a robust set of relationships that helps to make sure that we have those connections so we can find kids, we can make sure that they feel comfortable talking to us, we can make sure their family's connected. And that is all adds up, if these aren't in place, to lost learning time. Next slide. I want to remind you that prior to this, we had a definition of chronic absence for in-person learning. And for right now, we're recommending that you should continue to monitor any kid who is missing 10% or more of the learning opportunities that schools are offering. And that's whether absences are excused, unexcused, or due to suspensions. Next slide, please. And this means noticing in the first 2 weeks who just missed a couple of days, or in the first month, if you missed a couple of days. In the first 2 months, did you miss 4 days? We got to monitor, starting with the beginning of school, who's missing 10% or more of school. Next slide. And then we have to add to that, looking at, do you have working contact information? Do families have connectivity? Are there relationships? And are they now continuing to show up to learning now that we're offering it, whether it's hybrid, whether it's in person, whether it's virtual? Next slide. As you think about your role in advocates, one of the things you can do is you can ask about the data from this first month of school. We've never tried to reinvent schooling in the way we're reinventing it now. We don't know whether it works. We have to look at our attendance, our participation, our connectivity, and our chronic absence data. And you want to get that data overall and disaggregate it by ethnicity, student population, grade, and school. And when you get that data, you're going to want to ask, how is attendance being defined? What allows a student to be counted as present, especially in remote learning? Because if it's a low bar that almost anything counts as kids showing up, you may see high levels of attendance that are actually masking a lack of real meaningful participation. You're going to want to ask, how often is attendance taken? Is it daily? And how many absences start to activate early intervention and prevention and support? So a few places are actually starting to make this data available. Most places, you're probably going to have to ask districts, ask states to see the data. I'm going to give an example, although from one place. This is Oakland, California. Next slide. And you could also show this to a district that you're working with to show that it is possible to release this. They actually update this weekly, and they're showing participation rates. The one challenge is they are right now just showing participation rates. They haven't yet shown chronic absence data. When you look at it, you might think, oh, 92, 93% of the kids showing up, that sounds like they're doing okay. But actually, you need to disaggregate it more to answer that question. Next slide. When you take that data and you disaggregate it by ethnic group, you see that actually in this district, African-American kids, Latino kids, and Native American kids are not showing up nearly as much as some of their peers. That means that some of those positive conditions of learning may be less in place, or that their connectivity is just not present. So disaggregating is key to knowing who might need more support. Next slide. The other thing I just want you to notice is that average daily participation or average daily attendance can still miss high levels of chronic absence. A lot of places it's taking them a little while to put in the chronic absence data because they're still putting in place their data systems. But you can even have a 90, 95% average daily participation and still have like 20% of your kids chronically absent. So you're going to want to ask again for multiple metrics. So hopefully that'll just start us off about how do you think about attendance and looking at that. And I will turn it back to, I guess, is it over to Brennan or?
We're going to pause for 1 second. But thank you so much, Hetty. I think, one of the things that Hetty was really just walking us with, we need more data than ever, and we need it in more real time. And a lot of those measures she was talking about in particular were kind of measures that exist right now. But I think especially for those of you who have joined us at prior boot camp, we've talked a lot about the state and local report cards that are required under ESSA. And we really don't want to lose sight of those big annual reporting pieces that provide really powerful data for families and communities and frankly advocates to help advocate on behalf of their students. So we're going to pause and launch another poll question here just to ask how many of you has your state released a report card with data from last school year yet? And so you will see the poll pop up. Yes, no, I don't know. So I'll give people just about 30 seconds to answer that.
Tara, while they're answering, I just want to say being able to look at the data is more important than ever. One of my fears right now as people look at data is that if they look at average participation rates, they're actually thinking their attendance is pretty good when it's not. And this is a moment when we more than ever have to be able to get data even faster than the end of the year so we can see what we can address. But having end of the year from last year is definitely a starting point.
All right, so we are going to end the poll there. It looks like about 20% of you said yes, your state had released report cards. About 28% of you said no, and about 50% weren't sure. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Brendan Parton with the Data Quality Campaign, who joined us the last time we were able to be together in person to talk about report cards. And so she's going to give us an update on what report cards look like now for those of you that don't know, and what you might be expecting over the course of this year. So go ahead, Brendan.
Thanks, Tara. And I want to thank Hetty too. You do such a good job of reminding us why chronic absence is such an important indicator, but also, and as I'm going to hit on, why breaking down data by different groups of students is so important. And I know we're also tired of hearing now more than ever, but more than half the states, I won't bury the lead, are still missing disaggregated data on their report cards. More than half of the states. It was unacceptable before the pandemic, it's unacceptable now, and it's something I hope you will all have your eyes on as states start to release 2019, 2020 report cards, because I don't think they're going to be pretty. But transparency still matters. That's my title here, is transparency matters. It has always mattered, and it really matters right now. And report cards are one of the transparency and communications tools that states have to tell us about whether schools are serving the kids in their care. So if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide, Sarah, I think just reiterating this year. So as you all know, assessments and accountability were waived at the end of this past school year. And those two pieces have always been the crux of state report cards. DQC, and just like you heard Sarah say at the top, we've never wanted accountability to be the only purpose of report cards. Like I said, it should be about transparency and communication, but many states did design their report cards really just around getting that accountability information out. And that means as we look for report cards, this year, we're going to be missing a lot of the things that we care about that help us understand whether schools are serving students. But even with this missing data, I hope 1 year of missing data, there are things that states can still share. So I have a quick checklist here. We put this out in pretty short order after waivers came out, because we wanted advocates like you all to be able to hold states' feet to the fire on the things that they can and should still be doing. And first is per pupil expenditure data. You heard Hetty talk about hold harmless in school funding. That data is lagged. It's not even about the 2019-2020 school year, it's about the previous year. And we're gonna need some comparison points. Advocates like you, school leaders, the folks who we expect to engage with that data, they need a place to start. And this was really the first year that states were gonna be putting this data out anyway, and we want them to still do it. Post-secondary outcomes for last year's graduates, course and program enrollment, did kids have access to meaningful coursework in the past school year? Educator information, demographics, qualifications, the basic student enrollment, grades, demographic stuff. This kind of stuff can still come out. They still have it. They still know it. It didn't change. And that last point of past year's data, I think, is going to be huge, because we need a comparison point. That should be the point of these report cards always, is to be able to understand not just whether schools were serving students this year, but have they been improving? Have they been getting worse over time? And I'll just pick on my home state of Tennessee. I know a few of you are on from Tennessee, just released their 2019-2020 school year report card. And they, if I can use the word, buried the past year's data. They made a decision to not make that easy to find. And so as we're thinking about what we need to know now, being able to go back and say, where was this school before this incredible disruption happened, is going to be pretty important. So really look for that past year's data. Let's not let states off the hook for that. On the next slide, I have a list of a few things that states can share with modification. So they might need to change definitions a little bit, or they might need to put a caveat about when they stopped or started collecting it. You'll notice that very first on this list is that we have chronic absenteeism. There was much hand wringing about how to count chronic absenteeism as school got disrupted in March. But I guess our sense has been, and I'm, love conversation about this, but if you were chronically absent in March, safe to say you were probably chronically absent following that. You saw from Hetty's slides, it's just a few days of school that we're talking about. We already needed to know that. Discipline and safety instances. High school graduation, I will say on this one, really look out for, especially if you've got schools in your community that you're looking out for. If all of a sudden a school has a 100% graduation rate, when maybe last year it was only 85%, which is still something to celebrate. What happened there? How did they change that definition? What does that really mean for those kids? And then of course, course and program completion, another thing that states may have changed definitions of. So on the next slide, I do want to highlight Ohio, and I have two sides of this coin. One, the good side, the positive side, is that the legislature in Ohio took it upon themselves. They were still in session, as most states were, as the pandemic hit, to say, we are going to mandate that we are still putting out a report card. We believe that transparency matters. And even though we have this waiver from the feds, we're going to put out as much data we can. That's good. Hooray, legislative leadership. The flip side of this is that you can see this is their landing page. Achievement data front and center, post college and career readiness front and center. A lot of things that hinge on assessment data are front and center. This is usually kind of a lovely entry point for this report card, but it means you're going to be clicking and finding a lot of blanks for this calendar year. It's going to take a little bit more digging to find the things that I talked about in my first slide that are still available. So for advocates like all of us that want to be taking a look, know that we're going to need to be digging around a little bit to find what we need to know. So thinking forward, thinking of how we get better by releasing report cards in 2022, we need to be, again, holding states' feet to the fire to get ready. And one of the big things to get ready for is planning for assessments. If we hope to have at least some of the assessment data back, some way to administer assessments and be able to understand how kids did, what that achievement gap, what that learning loss looks like, they need to be planning for administration now. I know that's a little bit different than report cards, but again, if we want the data back, we need to be planning for it now. Hand in hand with that is being able to measure skip year growth. So skip year growth uses exactly what it sounds like. We don't have the assessment data for this year, but we have it for last year and next year. You can calculate a growth measure based on that. It doesn't tell us quite the same things, but we still need to know that, and we really need that broken down by different groups of students, disaggregated growth and assessment data. And finally, preparing to provide information about who didn't take assessments and why. If you're familiar with the data quality campaign, we were founded with the 10 essential elements of state data system, and that last one about who didn't take assessments was element 4. So states should have been having mechanisms to collect this data for the past decade, and man, is it important for them to be transparent about that right now. So I believe that is my last slide. Sarah, if you, yep, this is how you can track me down. And with that, I'll turn it back to my EdTrust colleagues.
Great, thank you so much, Brennan. We know this is fast and furious. It's a lot of content, and I see a couple of people adding comments to the chat. I'd encourage you, if you have questions, please start adding them. We also have a few minutes at the end of this session. We have about 15 minutes left. But also, if you are in a state, I know Jonathan, who's the EdTrust State Director in Texas, shared some information. If you know if your state has released a report card, or you know something about how they're capturing attendance, please feel free to share links for your state in the chat so other advocates can see those as well. But we are going to move forward, and we just want to take a few minutes to touch on one of the points Brennan brought up here, which is on the state and local report cards, kind of one of the key metrics around student learning is data on the state assessment. And so we just want to take a few minutes to think about what that might look like this year, and to just reiterate why that measure is valuable and why it's particularly valuable in this time. But I want to pause for a second. Instead of a poll, we're going to use the chat function. Why do you think state assessments are important? So we heard from Brennan that kids didn't take those assessments last year, given the quick transition to online learning. States are starting to think about what they're going to do this spring. But I'm going to pause and hope that you add to the chat why you think state assessments are important for this year. All right, I saw Jen jump in to note it's important to know where students are now so we know where they need support. Any others want to drop into the Zoom chat? All right, shedding light on inequity within a state system. Understanding disparate impacts on different groups of students. I think we saw that even with Hetty's data on attendance in Oakland, right? That we're starting to see some patterns. And I think that certainly echoes what we heard Denise and Marielle talk about in the opening plenary, as well as the ability to look at cross districts or see academic impact. Great, all right, Sarah, why don't we go ahead and jump in? We can go ahead and go to the next slide too. So I think there are three primary benefits we just wanted to highlight about using student outcome data from statewide assessments. You know, they offer comparability, which we saw in the comments, this ability to look from district to district or school to school. They're fairly objective measures we'll talk about compared to some of the other more subjective measures of student learning, and they can help us unpack some of the impact on academic outcomes for students. I do just want to be really clear, we're talking about these annual statewide assessments that students take at the end of the year. We know there are many places that are taking kind of beginning of the year, what we call diagnostic or formative assessments that are intended to give educators kind of an immediate look at where students are performing. But in most states, those aren't consistently given across the state, and they're not generally publicly reported in the same way our state assessment data is. And then just wanted to share some, a couple of quick points from Brennan and our colleagues at the Data Quality Campaign, that in a lot of parent surveying over the last few months, parents have indicated a strong interest in getting back to give these assessments so they can see where students are performing. And we'll drop the link to that poll in the chat so you can all see more. So we talked about comparability. They're a consistent measure of student learning, and we just wanted to give an illustration of why that's important. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I know that we have a few folks from Massachusetts on, so we are just using this because we had access to the data, but I think you could do a similar analysis in a lot of your states. We know that the state assessment data can help us uncover interesting or potentially surprising results. So I think for those of you from Massachusetts or those of you familiar with Massachusetts, you might not be that surprised looking at this chart, which shows kind of overall MCAS results. MCAS is a state assessment for different school districts. We're going to know it's just a subset of districts that had over 100 Black students, and you'll see why that's important in a second. Wealthier suburbs like Newton tend to be towards the top, and some of the higher need communities like Revere are further down. So you'll see Newton in the red bar here and then Revere in the yellow bar. But then look what happens on the next chart when we look at the results, particularly for Black students in the same district. Two things really pop out to us as advocates or community members when we look at this data. First, all the bars go down. In other words, all of these districts, regardless of how well they're doing overall, have much more work to do in providing equitable opportunities for Black students. But the other thing that you'll notice is that Newton and Revere have switched places. So what this is showing us, right, is even though Newton overall may be performing higher, it's actually doing a worse job of supporting its Black students in particular. And so that shows us that even these districts that may be perceived as high achieving or having better student outcomes still have a lot of work to do in supporting particularly students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. The other thing that I mentioned, right, is our state assessment data is the most objective measure we have. We know that grading practices can vary from school to school or district to district, and we know particularly in the spring in this school year, there's been even more variability in some places as districts tried to figure out the best way to provide grades to students or some other assessment of progress. The statewide assessment can provide is one tool that can help us see how all students are being supported. And just one of the things to think about this objective measure, Learning Heroes did national research in the spring. So I believe it was April or May. So after students had been home for a little while. And 92% of parents, even when their students were home more often, believe that their student was on or above grade level. But if we use the NAEP assessment, which is kind of the highest quality national test that we have, we see that the actual percentage of students attaining proficiency is significantly lower. And so one of these things is our state assessment should be an objective measure to help us get those numbers closer together so parents have a real understanding of where their student is at. Right, Sarah? And then the last thing we'll just note, right, is that we think all the data we mentioned at the beginning of this about student social emotional learning, their access to nutrition, to connectivity, their participation, all of those things are critical, but we also don't want to lose sight of the fact that we want students to be learning and we want them to be making academic progress. And our statewide assessments are both a signal of that, but they're also critical as one piece of understanding how this crisis has impacted students. And they need to be considered along with this other data, but we think that these things go together. Go to the next slide. I do want to say, and I've been trying to follow some of the chat and seen some of the questions, but I think it's important to know that the assessments aren't perfect. It doesn't mean that our statewide assessments don't need any changes and that they are good as they are. We know that right now that they are the best measure that we have, and they're the most objective and allow us to see across districts to districts and schools to schools, but there's certainly ways they can be improved in both the near term and the long term. So particularly for this school year, a couple of things we've been thinking about is how can states think about shifting their assessment windows? So I was a high school teacher. I know we took the state assessment about 8 weeks before the school year ended. And during that 8 weeks after the state test, we did project-based learning, or we relearned content or recovered things to help students prepare for the next school year, but we weren't necessarily teaching new content because the expectation was that we had taught the content before the assessment. In this school year, we know that we need every day that is possible to be teaching new content because of the interrupted instruction we had in the spring. So one suggestion we've pushed advocates to think about, and I know in some of your states are considering this, is actually shifting the assessment window back so teachers can reclaim that time to teach new content. Thinking about how to shorten or streamline the statewide assessments. We often hear about over-testing or redundancy. A lot of that occurs at the classroom level with teacher-developed or school-developed or district-developed tests, but there are certainly ways we can still improve the state assessment. We need to continue thinking about how to make these assessments culturally inclusive, and that includes providing them in students' native language to make sure we're really assessing content knowledge and not just language proficiency, and continuing to move away, making these tests reflect kind of the real world questions and problems our students will face. And then just increasing our alignment from what teachers are teaching in their individual classrooms and across their districts to what's in the standards to what's reflected on their statewide assessment. So we say all that to say is right now the statewide assessment is critical to give us data on what's been happening, but simultaneously we have to be thinking about how to make those assessments better. All right, Sarah. So we have about 6 minutes left. I know that was a lot of content. So I'm gonna pause here and say you can add questions to the chat if you have them, or you can use the reaction function at the bottom of Zoom if you wanna raise your hand. If you had a question earlier in the chat, I will say, please add it again because it may have gotten lost, but I see our first question here. Any thoughts on advocacy that helps to preserve the rigor of a state test while shortening and streamlining them? This has been a challenge in Michigan. There's no fast answer to this, I would say. I think that some of the work states have done over the last few years, in particular to make the move the assessments online to online platforms, have had some success in streamlining, but still work to be done. Some states have put into place a cap on the maximum amount of time that students can spend testing, which has then really driven states to work closely with their test vendors and developers to streamline and tighten the assessment as much as possible. So they still get the information they need, but they stay under specific guidelines from the state. How do we lessen the punitive? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to just offer a thought, and it's connected to the one that you were just about to read about the lack of safety and well-being and assessment scores. I think one of the things people should over time push for is actually greater analysis of that data. And the other thing I would just say about the attendance data, I just want to acknowledge, I actually think we have to get better at knowing what metrics for attendance actually are associated with worse outcomes, and then what is the best early warning. Is it the completion of assignment? I suspect some of the logging on data may not prove as effective. And if we think about this as we're not just here for a year, we're here for 2 to 3 years, we would think about even for the state assessment data, a couple year approach to thinking about this work. I really feel like we sometimes, one of the problems with the pandemic is we've been too short-sighted. Like we're addressing the problem of the immediate, not thinking we now have a couple years to use this opportunity to improve our assessments, to improve how we understand what the connections are, to make sure data is even more transparent, and we're advocating over a longer term, not just, you know, the next month or the next 2 months, but over a couple year approach.
Thanks, Hetty. This goes with the question you were saying about are we testing academic learning or inequity and access to resources? I think that's one of the reasons we have strongly advocated that we need this assessment data to look at academic outcomes, but we also need to collect the other data to help unpack some of that, right? If we just look at the state assessment data on its own, we're not going to be able to answer that question. But if we look at the state assessment data and we see parallels between the academic outcomes and then students who had a lack of access to nutritional resources they needed, health resources they needed, the areas that were most economically impacted by the pandemic and their recession that we are in the midst of and moving forward with, we think we have to interpret those together. And so I will say in the near term, we have to start collecting this data, and we hope that you as advocates are pushing your districts and states to be collecting data on those various measures, because some of them are frankly areas they weren't collecting data on before. And schooling looks different now, and so we're going to need some new data. But we also, as Brennan shared, have a lot of existing data that we can keep collecting and we can keep reporting, and we don't want to lose sight of that either. And so in many ways, this is about expanding and getting more specific about our data, not just throwing up our hands and not collecting data at all. And it's about presenting those data points together. But Brennan or Hetty, anything you want to add to that?
Both of you are prompting for me. You know, Hetty kept mentioning early warning systems, and we've been really racking our brain on this at DQC that even as long as many states have had data systems or much as they're improving, they haven't really done that much longitudinal analysis. Like, we know the ABCs are early warning. What, anybody got another one they know to be a great indicator that's come out of their state data analysis? So prompting your states while they have all this free time, because there wasn't assessments this year, to be thinking about their research agenda. And to your point, what can we learn with the data that we do have? Again, like, that's a pandemic opportunity that, to Hetty's point, we should be pushing on and thinking about over time.
I would just also add, I was thinking, we also need to use the data to push for understanding what works. Your example of the data from Massachusetts is a perfect example. It's not only to notice that Revere actually did better, but to then say, okay, so what's happening in Revere? I also would suspect that there are low-income communities, which almost all have challenges of food and other kinds of things, because those are poverty-related issues, but some poverty-related communities do better. And I think that may be because they've invested in access to food. They've invested to a different approach to safety. They've had community schools. And that might even be both a short-term and a long-term. What can you know from this first month of school, first 2 months of school, of who's emerging as a bright spot, so that you can scale that out, and then also calling for long-term research on that.
Thank you. I'm going to try to keep us on time. I know we are at 2:50, and people will need time to close out their Zoom and jump back into the Hopin platform. I'm seeing a couple of other questions. I'm going to download the chat and try to follow up with you over the next couple of days. In Hopin, there's the ability to individually reach out to people. Hopefully you can see up on the slides, we've listed a couple of resources here. We'll drop the links in the chat. But after the sessions, you will be getting access to recordings from every session, including those you weren't able to attend during this breakout time, as well as the resources that we have listed here. So we will share those with you as soon as we have them. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you in particular to Hetty and Brennan for joining us today to just think comprehensively about what data we need to be looking at. And we look forward to seeing you all back over in Hopin shortly.
Thank you.
Okay.